Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US Pie's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have another insightful episode for you today. Joining me is Nicki Truesdell, a homeschool mom, author, speaker, and fearless advocate for biblical education. Nicki's writing has encouraged countless families to take charge of their children's education and boldly reject government schooling. We'll be talking about her recent article, I Told You So, School Choice Updates since 2023, where she lays out why school choice may not be the silver bullet many conservatives think it is, and how government entanglement threatens true educational freedom. Before I bring her on, please give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to the show. And don't forget to visit uspie.org to learn more and join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. Pie's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US Pie on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. Joining me today is Nicki Truesdell, founder of NickiTruesdell.com, where she speaks truth about education, parenting, and the role of Christians in shaping the next generation. She's a veteran homeschool mom of 5, a national speaker, and the author of Anyone Can Homeschool. Nicki Truesdell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today.
Yes, and I'm excited to have you. And as I told you before the show, I learned from my daughter-in-law that you're famous among homeschool moms. So I'm glad to have a star on the show, and I really appreciate all that you do.
Thank you.
So let's jump into your recent article. I Told You So. You've been warning about the risk of government-funded school choice for years, and now you say we're seeing the consequences play out. Can you explain what's happening and why you believe these warnings are coming true?
Well, I got into this not by choice, but because in Texas, the Texas Homeschool Coalition started pushing for vouchers or ESA accounts back in, I believe, 2016 and 2017. And so I was kind of shocked that a homeschool organization, basically it's the State Homeschool Association. I was shocked that they would actually push for government involvement in homeschooling in any way. And they were also pushing the Tim Tebow bill, which is, homeschoolers involved in public school sports. And so I just went down the rabbit hole trying to learn all I could about ESAs and vouchers, and it didn't look like a good idea to me. And so obviously a lot of Texas homeschoolers felt the same way, that this is a terrible idea. And so since then, I've kept up with as much of the news as possible. It's hard to do when you're also a full-time mom, but I just, as a veteran homeschooler and someone, I was raised homeschooled, someone who was there when we were still fighting for our freedom in Texas, I look at this idea and think, why would anybody take us backwards? Why do we want to go backwards and give up the freedom that we fought for only about 30 years ago and give it back to the government? And so that's what I believe vouchers will do. That's what I believe the ESAs, in any fashion, when government is stepping their toe into your homeschool, into your living room, you are going to be giving up freedom. And it doesn't happen on the first day. Usually it's going to be a process where first they give you the freebies and then things start to change down the road. And there's so many examples of that already, but one that I talked about in my article was West Virginia, where the homeschoolers of West Virginia actually, when their voucher law was passed, I don't remember if it's a voucher or ESA. It's all the same, everyone. It's all the same.
Mhm.
The homeschoolers actually got their law written in such a way that those who take the money and those who don't take the money are separated in the law, and so that whatever comes down the road that affected the ESA recipients would not affect the private homeschoolers. And that's a good thing. That's probably the best way to get these laws written. Well, only a couple years later, West Virginia came back and attempted to lump all of them back into the same category. So that would mean there was no protection for the people who don't take the money. Now, the homeschool movement in West Virginia was able to defeat that. But the reason I bring this up is because it just shows that that is the goal. That is the goal. They will give you your freebies up front, and then they're going to continue to try to clamp down on the freedom of everyone who homeschools outside the public system. And if it takes several years, they've got several years. They're very patient and they will keep working at it. And so the same thing, not exactly the same, but in Florida, something along the same lines is happening right now. They have ramped up the regulations for their recipients. Well, once you started taking the money, it's going to be harder to stop taking the money. And so people who started taking the money under pretty lax rules are going to just kind of be grandfathered in because it's so convenient to get several $1,000s and to get all of your lessons paid for, all of the free books and computers. And so, of course, very few are going to say, well, you can stop sending me that check now because I don't like your rules. Most people that are in the system are going to stay in that system. And so those are just a couple examples of why I wrote the article, I Told You So, because this is exactly what we were predicting many years back, 7, 8, 9 years ago, when the idea was still being floated. We said, here's what they're probably going to do. And that's exactly what's happening. And the more we see these school choice bills passed all across the United States, the more we're going to see the very same things follow.
Well, I agree absolutely. And so, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been involved with politics a very long time, and I'm probably a generation ahead of you when it comes to education policy and everything else as far as that goes. But I have evolved. When I ran for the state house many years ago, it was my primary platform plank was school choice. And as you
Mm,
probably know, it's been the quote unquote silver bullet for Republicans for as long as
mhm,
I've been involved in politics.
mhm,
So when we started United States Parents Involved in Education in 2015, I had allies in other states who helped me to form the organization, and they gently mentored me into understanding the pitfalls. So I can say that I understand how people would think. I had all of the arguments about school choice and why it was such a wonderful thing, and this was
mhm.
back before it was even popular like it is today. We were
Yeah.
fighting to try to implement it in those days. And so I've evolved, and I'm praying that interviews like this and others that we've done on this topic will help to bring other people along and mentor them to understand. So I really think that the big explosion came, of course, after COVID lockdowns and the
Mhm.
government school parents had their kids at home. I've talked about this a lot. I think everybody agrees that that's when parents' eyes were opened and they realized that what their children were learning in government schools was pure indoctrination. And so I think homeschooling doubled after that.
Mhm.
And, a lot of parents want an alternative and have become addicted, if you will, to the government raising their children. So they think that there's
Yeah.
no way I can't work. We have to have the two incomes. I couldn't possibly homeschool. I can't afford private school. So then comes, the Republican Party and their grand solution, and it's just snowballed all over the country. And of course,
Yeah.
it's not just a bad thing for homeschools, but also for private and Christian schools, which will become dependent, as you suggested, homeschool parents would dependent on the funds. And
Yeah.
should the regulations come behind it, which we know it will, then they're going to be forced with a choice whether to close their doors or compromise. So that's the scape of things, the landscape of things as I
Mhm.
see it. So as you point out, of course, in your article, that once the government money enters the picture, it always comes with strings attached, even for private and Christian schools, which I've just mentioned. So do you have some examples of what you're seeing now to prove how school choice programs are starting to compromise biblical education?
Yes, and I wish I had this information in front of me, but one of the things I just read this over the last couple weeks was that this money that goes to private and charter schools is in fact, this is longer than just a couple weeks, but this money will fund private schools. And so in Texas, which is where I mostly pay attention, the law was passed. It hasn't been implemented yet. It was just this year. But what that's going to do, and what a lot of the people in Texas have already uncovered, is that this money will go to fund um, DEI programs if any private school has them. It will fund Islamic run schools. It doesn't matter what they teach, as long as they got approved for the funds, then we will all be funding that. Just like we are already funding it in public schools and we don't like it and we don't have a say. Now we're going to be funding it even more. We're going to be funding all kinds of ideas. And actually people on the left who are they're opposed to school choice, they make this argument, and they're right, that they're going to be forced to fund things that they don't agree with. And so people will say, well, we already do that anyway. But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right to add on to this problem. We should not be funding ideologies that are un-American and that go against anyone's religion. And so doing it for public schools never was right. Expanding that into private schools and even homeschool curriculum is the same way. It should not be allowed. And so across the country, I what I have in my article is the most updated things I can find, but we've seen new laws got passed this year, and so I expect they'll go into effect either in September or next January. And then we're going to really start to see what's happening. We're going to see different private schools getting funded that are teaching things that we don't agree with. And like I said, things that are un-American, and that should not be happening in the United States of America.
Oh, I agree. And so this has been a while back, but I think it was Arizona that passed universal school choice, and right out of the box, the Democrat governor said, we're going to, expand. We're going to require testing, all the things that the government schools are required. They were going to try to force onto the Arizona students. And then the other thing I heard about Arizona after they passed that was that the private schools increased their tuition. So for families who thought they were gaining some benefit, it still made it out of reach for them because the private schools just increased their tuition. So there really was no benefit in the long
There
run.
is.
So
There isn't. I don't know of any. I think there was a lot of research done in Texas when this fight was happening this spring, that there are little or no private schools that charge a tuition that would fall under the $10,000 available with this bill. And so it's a coupon. And what a lot of people said is it's a coupon for the wealthy, basically. Those who already have
mhm.
their kids in expensive private schools, they'll get a discount. They'll get $10,000 off, and for everybody else, it's still unattainable. And $10,000 per child is a lot of money to be handing out every single year anyway. And as far as some other states, there are states that I think Arkansas is one of them. And when I name these, some of them have tried this, some of them have already implemented it and are making it happen. But parents who homeschool typically are very adamant about medical freedom too. And so a lot of them choose to either delay or avoid altogether getting the regular vaccine schedule for their children. But in certain states, they're trying to make that mandatory even for homeschoolers. And this is the problem. We've seen the argument, well, you don't have to take the money. If you don't like the rules, don't take the money. But as I said with West Virginia, this medical freedom thing is not even homeschool related, but they're lumping it in because they're seeing parents making decisions on their own, basically saying, we don't need your expert advice. We're going to make the decisions that we feel are best. Homeschoolers are notorious for that. So in other states where they're not even worrying about test scores or ESAs, they're actually going after parents for their medical freedom and saying, we're going to have to send someone into your home once a month or once a quarter to check on your kids, to interview them for mental health problems, to see the vaccine schedule and things like that. But all of this has ramped up because of the ESA thing, because of people saying we need freedom, we need choice. And when you open this box, that's the problem. You open this box and say everybody gets to look at our homeschool and decide how well they think we're doing it. there's no end to the chaos that's going to ensue. There's no end to government regulating things. Everybody knows that. And so, yes, there's so many different ways that freedoms are being compromised. You mentioned Arizona too, and the Arizona law specifically states that if you take their ESA, you are actually not considered a homeschooler anymore. You are an ESA schooler, which means you're not going to a public school building, but you're basically under the public school umbrella now. So, I mean, that's something I wouldn't want to give up, because when you give that up, you give up everything. And I've had our Arizona homeschool parents argue with me and try to tell me, oh no, we haven't given up anything. But then they keep using words approved and this is allowed and not allowed and this is the list I get to choose from and things like that. That's not freedom.
Well, you are so right about that. And, I think that one of the reasons we've seen some Democrats starting to come along is for what you just described. And I actually did an interview on Newsmax a few months back, and they showed a clip of a legislature. I forget what state it was in, and they were debating, and a Democrat was promoting their ESA or voucher or whatever it was, and I was asked my opinion of that, and there was someone else on the show that said, "Oh well, they're just starting to see the light," and I told him, I said, yeah, I think they understand that once they start accepting the money, they can control all education.
Right.
And believe me, that's what the liberals want more than anything. They've been very naive for a long time to not realize that this is the perfect vehicle for them to have that happen. So, yes, I think that we're even seeing the Democrats come along because they do want to control all forms of education.
Behind the Democrats' desires is the desires of the United Nations, and that's even more sinister. That we know that this plays into their whole goal for education, to get everyone under the government umbrella in one way or another.
Yes, and we've actually interviewed Alex Newman, and he's talked about that quite a bit. And I've done some
Yeah.
research myself on the UN's involvement and their goals, the UNESCO goals, and they want to be able to control the education
Hmm.
nationally around the world. And
Hmm.
the only way they can do that is through the government and this concept of government funding.
Yes.
So, Nikki, we need to take a short break. And when we come back, I'd like to ask you about the response from conservative leaders, many of whom still support school choice legislation. I know that you've been doing battle in Texas, and I talk with legislators all the time on the state and federal level, and we know that their propensity is 100% towards school choice. There might be a few
Hmm.
exceptions, but let's talk about that when we get back. I'll be back with my interview with Nicki Truesdell right after this.
Parents be warned, your children are learning Marxist critical theories, anti-American propaganda, and so-called social justice advocacy. Government schools teach that America is systemically racist, teaching children to hate themselves, each other, and their nation. Although many states have enacted legislation to curtail these insidious pedagogies, numerous educators circumvent the law to indoctrinate impressionable students. Recently, over 5,000 teachers across the country signed a pledge to continue teaching critical race theory, saying, "We refuse to lie to young people about U.S. history and current events, regardless of the law." While many states now prohibit teaching critical race theory, countless school districts have skirted the laws by using federal COVID relief money instead. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, and connect with us at USPie on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Nicki Truesdell, homeschool mom, author, and founder of NickiTruesdell.com. Nicki, you've called out conservative lawmakers for pushing government-funded school choice programs. Why do you think so many well-meaning conservatives are falling for this trap? And what would you say to those who still believe it's the answer?
Well, this is something that is baffling to me, and it has been since I first stumbled on this topic because, like I said, I first found it through the Texas Homeschool Coalition, which is a very conservative organization. And then I started realizing that they were being backed by conservative um, elected officials. And So it's definitely been a process over these years because there were many conservatives that didn't want anything to do with it, but they've been lobbied, and that's the only thing I can think of. They've been lobbied to change their stance. I mean, I've had my own reps in Texas go from, no, we support public schools, we wouldn't do anything to damage the funding for that, to flipping completely over to ESAs and school choice. And in Texas, they excuse it by increasing public school funding and saying, "Don't worry, guys, we've got more money for you too." So they're just throwing money at everything.
Mm.
But a lot of them will actually cite Milton Friedman and, say, "Well, he came up with this idea years ago and he's a conservative, and so if he says it, it must be good." But one of the things he said, and this is the part I agree with, he said parents could express their views about schools directly by withdrawing their children from one school and sending them to another to a much greater extent than is now possible. Now, this is without a voucher. He's just talking about the free market. He's talking about, you make a choice. You say, "I don't like this public school, so what will we do different? We'll either pay for a private school or we will homeschool." And that's the basis of choice. That is actual school choice. And then I know that he goes on to say a voucher would be a good idea. Now, this was long before vouchers were actually imposed. And so, in theory, it may sound like a good idea, but I don't know, it never sounded like a good idea to me. So, I don't understand conservatives who look at that and say, "Sure, I love it," because it's not conservative. It's not a free market principle if the government is paying for all of it. That's not free market. That's still a monopoly. And so it's like conservatives have just had their brains rewired. In fact, during this Texas session of the legislature, that's all we could assume. It felt like we had a lot of brand new, super conservative reps get elected, and this was their first term, and they were anti-voucher and very conservative, and they went there, and many of us said it's like someone opened up the top of their head and rewired a few things, and then they became robots for school choice. It is like a gut punch. It is devastating, and I don't get it, but I know that in the Texas legislature, Governor Abbott made it his number one priority, and stranglehold is what he did. He basically threatened any future legislation by these reps, and it was the most sickening public display of force that, I mean, every single day, multiple tweets, Facebook posts, and everything about how awesome school choice was, photo ops with every single rep in Texas, and we have a lot of them, just saying, "Look, we're all in agreement." And these were people that I had talked to on the phone. I knew these people personally, and they flipped. So they use Milton Friedman, and then I believe that they either don't understand what it's going to do to freedom, but how could they not? How could they not understand that? And then I believe there's a lot of coercion. There's a lot of money behind this lobby, behind the school choice lobby. And like we said, the UN is part of it, but there's so many players in the game. It's unreal. It's unreal, but I don't have a good solid answer for why conservatives would flip their views, except to say that they have been lobbied to do so.
Well, that makes sense, and I continue to scratch my head too. But that's an interesting scenario you described because you had sounds like freshmen, strong, probably MAGA type people that went
Very
in one
much.
way and came out another way. It's just incredible. But another thing you talked about was the money, how they said, "Well, don't worry about the government schools. We've got more money coming from for you." And that reminded me of our state in South Carolina. So you had Governor Abbott pushing your school choice legislation, and in our state, it was our state superintendent of education, who's a Republican, quote unquote conservative. I actually challenged her in that race,
Mm.
unsuccessfully in the long run, but nonetheless. And so she was a huge ESA person. She'd been lobbying for this through her private nonprofit organization for 6 or 8 years probably, and then she gets elected superintendent, and she's got this bully pulpit, and she already has all of the Republican legislators in her pocket,
Hmm.
and so they pushed it on through. And then once I read the legislation, I realized they're funding two systems. So, the left had always argued when I was a proponent of it that we'd be taking money from the government schools, right? That was their big argument. Well, not anymore. And maybe that's how they're able to get some of these Democrats on board is they're not even taking the money already allocated in our state. It sounds like it's probably a lot more in your state, but ours is up to about, I think, 13,000 per child, total funding. So it's not like they're taking a part of that money. They've actually created a whole new funding stream in our
Yep.
state because we have something in our state constitution. Well, you're probably familiar with the Blaine Amendment. It's in many state constitutions. And so when they passed the legislation the first time, our state Supreme Court shot it down. And then so they
Mm-hmm.
came back the next year, being crafty legislators that they are, and came up with another scheme, and that was to fund it through our lottery proceeds. So
Mm-hmm.
that's when it really became apparent to me. We're talking about a whole separate pot of money. And I still don't understand how that's not government money because government decides how it's spent.
Right.
But yes, two parallel systems, two funding streams, and I don't think most people understand that. We spend so much money on education already and have abysmal results. As you probably know, the most recent NAEP scores, I think 40% of fourth graders are below basic in reading. They can't even read. So
Mm-hmm.
we're not getting anything, no kind of return on this funding, and yet the
That's
government wants to
interesting.
fund.
Yeah. So you said they thought it was the money would come out of the public school funding, and that's what liberals didn't want. And so they
Mm-hmm.
came up with a new way to fund it. That's exactly what they did in Texas. So we have a surplus of, millions of dollars, which ought to go back to the taxpayers. If we've got too much money in government, send it back to the people that you took it from, right?
Amen.
But in
Amen.
Texas, they decided that the school choice funding would all come out of the surplus. So now we're still getting taxed as property owners to pay for public education, and they're going to use the surplus to fund school choice. But Texas is a huge state, and the first round of this bill um, does not allow for every student. It's not universal, even though the whole internet said it was universal. It's not. It starts with a small number of kids, and so they're going to have to grow it. And the financial note on it, the fiscal note was very clear that it's going to grow by millions every year. And so our surplus is going to dwindle very quickly. And then they're opening up a whole new office. Not a whole new office. The comptroller is going to control school choice. So not even an education bureaucrat, just the state comptroller is going to be in charge of that. And they're going to have to obviously hire new staff and set up new systems and all of that. So, yeah, it isn't this public school funding. The liberals, basically, the Republicans said, hey, we'll fix that problem. We'll just take the money from somewhere else. So now we're funding education twice. And as you said, also, well, I mean, you were pointing out the same thing that the same people are kind of funding it all. They're going to make everybody happy because it is a monopoly. It's still going to be a monopoly, and that's exactly. You've probably done your research on the DeVosses, but that's exactly what they said many years, like in the '90s. They said all education will be public, and that's exactly how they're going to make it work. Whether you sit at home and you log into a public school platform, or you go to the school down the street, all education will be public. There will be no private education. It's all going to fall under one umbrella. It's still going to be a monopoly, and that's not free market. That's not Milton Friedman at all.
Yes, you're 100% right on that as well. So, and I like the way you talked about choice, about how, we already have choice. And that's what my good friend Melanie, who's on our board of directors, likes to say is that we already have school choice. We can choose
Mhm,
whether to send them to government school or homeschool them. In fact, she
mhm.
likes to call it parental choice. She thinks that's a better term that we've been trying to pass along and have others adopt. So I've got another question for you. We could just go on and on, I think, you and I on this topic. So you've
Yes,
homeschooled for over 2 decades. So
yes.
what would you say to the parent listening right now who feels overwhelmed or unsure about leaving the government school system?
Oh, I could say a lot of things. The first thing I would say, and I actually just tweeted this a few days ago, that everyone I know who has started homeschooling wishes they had started sooner. They realize it's not nearly as impossible as it sounds. It's not anywhere close to as expensive as they thought, and it's so much better than they imagined. And so, if you are thinking about it, just jump in, just do it, because you're going to realize that all the things that you've thought in your head are not true. It's not difficult, it's not expensive, and it's so much better than you can imagine. And secondly, we're talking about money in this podcast today. And so I would say, um, if you already are considering it, you can do it. Anyone can do it. In fact, you can see my book behind me. I wrote the book Anyone Can Homeschool because of people who are unsure and afraid that they can't afford it, or they can't find the time, or maybe they think I can't run a public school. So you don't have to run a public school. You are just being a parent, and you're adding a little something extra to your responsibility, which in my opinion was always the parent's responsibility. And so it doesn't have to take 8 hours a day. It doesn't take 12 years. It doesn't take, the 9 month schedule. You can do it when you want, for as long as you want. You can buy the materials you want. And that's exactly why you do not need government assistance, because they're going to limit your options. Where if you're privately funded, the options are completely unlimited. Go to a homeschool convention and see all the options. See all the different curriculum options that there are available to homeschoolers. Public school teachers cannot even fathom what homeschoolers have available, and not just in the way of books, but in the mindset, the different methods. There's so many different methods and different ways and people out there to help you figure out which one works best at your house. I just want people to understand, you're not copying a public school when you decide to homeschool. It's not just transferring the chair to a different location. It's a whole different world, and it is a much better world. I could do
Amen.
this all day.
Well, and the thing I'd like to add to that I've heard my daughter-in-law say is that it's very rewarding. She
Hmm.
just really loves the fact that she is her child's teacher and she has 100% control over what they're learning. So,
Oh,
and another
absolutely.
thing, we hear about the fact that families might need to make a sacrifice in order to be
Hmm.
able to do this. And so, one of the things that Sam Sorbo said when she was on my show, and it stuck with me, and I keep repeating it, but it's just profound to me to think about that sacrifice is not a bad thing. That typically
No,
sacrifice means you're giving up something for something better. And
absolutely.
our greatest example, of course, is the sacrifice of Jesus. Without his sacrifice, we would all be lost. So
Hmm.
sacrifice is not a bad thing, and it is in order to attain something good. So,
Yes.
Nikki, we need to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you two questions I ask all my guests before closing the show. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Nicki Truesdell right after this.
A California school district suspended 2 children for 5 days because they quote unquote misgendered a biological male dressed like a girl by calling him he. A Tennessee student received a 3-day suspension for online satirical memes he posted mocking his principal. A New Hampshire teenager is suing his school district after he was suspended from athletics for saying there are only 2 genders. A North Carolina high school student was suspended for 3 days simply for using the term illegal alien. Schools across the country are limiting students' free speech, teaching them by example that free speech no longer exists in America. U.S. Parents Involved in Education's mission is to empower parents to resist the government school's Orwellian attack on free speech. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today has been Nicki Truesdell, author of Anyone Can Homeschool, and a bold voice calling parents to trust God, not the government, with their children's education. Nicki, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, I'd like to ask you two questions I ask all my guests. What are some of your biggest concerns right now, and what gives you hope?
Well, I'll start with the concerns. In homeschooling, let's start with education, concerns in education. I'm greatly concerned about the majority of our children being educated in the current public school system because I can homeschool my kids. I can talk about homeschooling all day long and try to encourage people to get started, but it's not making as big a dent as it needs to in the greater education sphere. And what troubles me is one of the things that you mentioned was that the outcomes are going down and down and down. Kids don't know how to read. Kids can't do very basic math. High school students graduate without having ever read one complete book. It's astounding to me. And so it's not enough to say, I'm going to do better for my kids, which is absolutely where we need to start. But what's going to happen to the future of America with a completely uneducated populace? And we can say, well, at least the homeschool kids will get out there and make a difference. But, you know, is that enough? We need all of our kids in America to be well educated. And I don't even care about competing with China and things like that. A well educated populace is a populace that's going to protect freedom. It's going to um, prevent tyranny and know how government operates and vote well. And so all of those things are very important. That's one of the things that concerns me the most is that the education system is not doing its job in America, and that affects all of us. Um, but I did say that homeschoolers are gonna I think homeschoolers are gonna make the difference, and I've been saying that for probably a decade at least to my friends privately who homeschool. Our kids are growing up knowing what God created as far as male and female. Our kids are going to learn the classics. They're going to understand government. They are going to be raised with a biblical worldview. They're going to be able to identify Marxism. And so having this little pocket, this little remnant, and it's not as little as it used to be. It's getting bigger and bigger, but that's what gives me hope is that number one, we've got homeschooling growing by leaps and bounds. And we have this little secret too. The homeschool families are often bigger. And so many homeschool families are obeying God's mandate to be fruitful and multiply. And so um, maybe we can win by sheer numbers over the decades. But, if I have 5 kids and you have 5 kids and, then they have 5 kids or anything close to that, it's gonna change. It's gonna shift, but it is a long game, and raising our kids this way isn't an overnight fix, but it's being faithful to what God has called us to do for our children, but also for our world, and I think that's what gives me hope right now to see homeschooling. Every time one new family says, "You know what? We're gonna pull our kids out of public school and we're gonna raise them at home," that gives me hope. I get so excited one mom at a time when they say that to me because I just think that's one family that's about to change for the better. Dave Ramsey says, change your family tree. And I say, this is exactly how you change your family tree. If you look at the Puritans of New England and, the impact, if you study the impact that the Puritans of New England made on America, their influence lasted for multiple generations, for more than decades, hundreds of years in America. And it's amazing because they were just raising families. They were faithful Christians who followed God's word very closely, and they took it seriously with raising their families and reading the scriptures and going to church. Their daily lives were all about service to God. And they weren't really trying to be evangelists and change the world, but they knew that it would change the world. And so we are still reaping the benefits of their faithfulness today. And I think of the Christian homeschoolers as sort of another Puritan group, not to say that we all believe exactly the same as the Puritans, but in their methods and in what the possible outcomes could be, that we could affect a whole new set of generations to come if we are faithful to what God has called us to do.
Amen. And let me just, before we close, I just want to follow up with what you said. It just aligns so perfectly with what we say in our organization, that we not only are protecting children, but we're protecting our country's freedom, because the majority of students in government schools, the majority of them are in government schools, and they are being indoctrinated against our country and with Marxist theories, and it's an intentional agenda. And so
It
you're
is.
right. It is growing, and the latest number I heard, and this may not sound like a lot to some of you, but it was much smaller just a few years ago. But I heard that 16% now of children are not in government schools, and that number is growing. So, and it was only not so long ago that my good friend Ray Moore, who leads Exodus Mandate, he was a man before his time, encouraging Christians to get their kids out of government schools. And his theory was if we could get to 30%, that the government schools would implode. I don't know if he sticks to that number now, but we certainly are getting closer. So there is hope. So thank you so much for your hope-filled answer to that question. And of course, we thank you for what you're doing and coming on the podcast today. So tell the viewers now how people can connect with your work and read your full article and purchase your book.
Sure. Well, I have a website. It's nickitruesdell.com. So that one's easy. And I've been writing there since 2009. So there's quite a bit of content. If anyone just has questions about homeschooling, I have a page called Homeschool 101, and I've listed most of my homeschooling blog posts in category order. So you can just read through that and really get an earful. But you can also get Anyone Can Homeschool, which is my book for anyone who thinks it's not possible, literally anyone. And I wrote that out of my own experiences, but also interviewing other parents, whether it's single parents, working parents, or single and working, which is often the case, parents with special needs children. The list goes on. Anybody who thinks they're in a situation that makes it impossible, I just want to say, you're not. It's possible for everyone. And I hope you'll read the book to figure out how. It's available at Amazon and Audible and Kindle. And I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and X, just under my name, so that's easy to find. And then my side project is knowledgekeepersbookstore.com. And what I've started doing there over the past few years is republishing old, out-of-print American history books. And so I just find the good stuff that was lost to the archives and things that I think are easy to read, because some old books are not, but I found the ones that are easy to follow, that tell firsthand stories of all the different things that happened in America. And so it's not a modern retelling of different things, but written by people that were there and saw it or lived it, or journals or letters and things like that. And so I take the text, reprint it just as it was, and then I usually add footnotes and photos whenever I can find them. So that's knowledgekeepersbookstore.com, and I have about 20 books in the series already, and those are available on Amazon, but you'll find all those links on my website if you're looking.
All right. Well, thank you again, Nicki. I've really enjoyed our time together today. Thank you, everyone, for listening and supporting our work. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, U.S. PI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional U.S. PI chapter in your area, please visit uspi.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.